Hi, and Happy New Year. My name is Doug Hess. I teach political science and policy studies at Grinnell College. And I want to thank the Rosenfield program for organizing this cyber teach-in related to the events of last week in Washington, D.C. I'm going to show you some slides to help organize my thoughts. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about the protests and about the elections, as well as election reform, and a bit about how the protest relates to social movements. So I think we need to speak very clearly and firmly when we refer to what happened last Wednesday. This was sedition. This was an insurrection. Sedition meaning inciting people to carry out an insurrection. And some of the speakers and planners of this protest clearly did that. There's no way for them to hide behind their words. Was it an insurrection? Well, this was probably the primary case of what an insurrection is. People attempted to use force, to use violence, to stop the transfer from one duly elected government to the next duly elected administration. They attempted to reverse the outcomes of a constitutionally held fair election through force. That's the dictionary definition of an insurrection, right? To overturn a government and replace it, to violate the Constitution in doing so. Now, some of the groups that mobilize people for the protest and their leaders have a well-known history of being involved in violence or training people to engage in violent protest or inciting violence. In fact, one of the leaders of these groups was arrested the day or 2 days before the protest in DC on weapons charges. And as several news outlets have documented very well, the discussion boards of some of these organizations included a lot of chatter about what tools to bring to break into Congress, what weapons or tactical gear to bring. And if you're exercising your First Amendment rights to protest, you don't normally bring, or you shouldn't bring, shields and helmets and crowbars or cans of mace. Clearly, the discussions were about, and some of the groups involved were about violence. And so speakers at the rally can't hide behind anything and pretend they did not know this is what was going to happen. And as a result of that, people died. Someone was crushed in the crowd. A protester was shot by Capitol Police and died, and a Capitol Police officer was killed. And of course, many more people were injured. So the US Capitol is now the site of a murder investigation. And we need to be blunt about this. Some of these speakers, including President Trump, there was a sitting member of Congress who spoke at the rally, and former New York City Mayor Giuliani used words that were incendiary, and they need to be considered accomplices to murder. Certainly, they need to be considered for charges of sedition. I also want to clarify some things related to the elections that happened in November and fairness issues. I think most people know that by and large, most election officials from both parties at the local level and state level, as well as many state leaders and federal officials, have refuted arguments and reject arguments claiming that Biden did not win or that the election was unfair. It's important to know that the elections in the US are run by local jurisdictions. So local jurisdictions such as counties, townships, boroughs, and if you live in Louisiana, they're called parishes. There's over 3,100 of these local jurisdictions, and within them, we have many precincts. So all told, there are tens of thousands of events occurring on election day and before, at which mistakes are going to happen. There's going to be implementation failures, technical failures, etc. But anybody looking at these issues seriously says that there's not enough there to overturn Biden's victory. There's not enough votes in question to overturn his victory. And certainly any malfeasance that occurred was not significant enough to draw into question the elections overall. Now, some Trump allies are making claims. For instance, Ted Cruz and some others I've heard in Congress made these claims last week that there are election fraud claims and unfairness claims that have not been investigated or aired out. And I think that's disingenuous. So first of all, there were 60 court cases brought by pro-Trump litigants after the elections that were dismissed by courts. I'm not aware of any significant cases that are still going forward. Certainly there are none, and I'm not aware of any other cases that are going forward. But these cases were sometimes rejected from courts using very blunt language, saying there's no evidence here. The case can't go forward without some kind of evidence, at least initial evidence. And they even went so far as to saying some of these papers that plaintiffs filed had no coherent legal rationale in them as to why the court should hear the case. So that's not a technical reason. That's an important reason to make sure courts and justice function properly. Some cases were dismissed for timing, which may be considered a technical reason, but there's also good doctrine behind this. If I lose an election and have complaints about election policy that I knew was in place for the past year or two or longer, the time for me to bring those lawsuits was earlier, not after I lost the election. It's not to say that there can't be issues in the final days or weeks of an election or on election day that can't be litigated. But to bring up complaints about policy overall, when people knew about this policy for some time, bringing them up after the election and asking the courts to overturn the election or say, let's do over the election, courts don't like that. And that's obviously a good doctrine because it would be chaotic otherwise. There's also this more complicated issue called standing. Standing means if I'm going to bring a lawsuit, does the court recognize me as someone who has the right to bring this lawsuit and in front of this court? So for instance, if I don't like some law in New Mexico about restaurants, as an Iowan who doesn't own a restaurant in New Mexico, I can't bring a lawsuit about that law unless I was to go to New Mexico and somehow be harmed by that law. People can't just bring up lawsuits whenever they please as a way of harassing people or creating confusion or adding to expense of the justice system. So there has to be some standing bar that people need to surpass to bring a lawsuit. And I've been involved in I guess maybe 24 lawsuits on voting rights issues. The map behind me, the blue stickers, include some of those cases. And standing is an important issue. And standing, I think civil rights and civil liberty groups believe standing should be a low bar because we don't want to deny people the right to courts or the right to have access to justice. But at the same time, if there's no threshold, chaos would reign. So cases that are rejected on standing, it is a complicated issue, but claiming it's a technical issue only, like not dotting your I's or crossing your T's, or you submitted too many pages in your legal brief or you didn't sign your name to it. It's not that kind of technical issue. It's a technical issue related to the smooth functioning of justice. As an aside, I'll point out that one court case that is frequently cited on issues of standing when it comes to membership organizations is a case I was involved with in the mid-1990s in Illinois on the National Voter Registration Act, one of the first lawsuits regarding that act, which was passed in '92. And our lawyer for that was Barack Obama, actually. All right. So what about social movements? What impact might the events of last week have on Trumpism? Well, it's a bit too soon to tell, but social movements to survive and to continue and to grow have to provide some victories to their members or potential members and supporters, or they have to have some positive framework, some positive narrative about any setbacks they do face. Otherwise, these social movements can't survive. So people have other things to do with their time and resources, and if a social movement doesn't make progress or doesn't have a good story about how they're about to make progress, that movement is unsustainable. Now, some people are saying that the events of last week have emboldened the hardcore Trumpist. But I think as some arrests occur and as more information comes out, and as people really consider the death of protesters and a police officer I think that might chip away at the ability of people to spin last week as anything other than a failure, particularly for what we call the sympathetic bystanders. So social movements may have a core that's made up of some organizations, maybe some professional staff even, and some diehard leaders and participants who put in lots of time and resources and effort. But social movements are also made up of this much fuzzier group of sympathetic bystanders who may occasionally participate, but largely lives are busy and they're doing other things. Some of them may be on the fence. Maybe they're sympathetic to the movement, but not actually doing anything about it. I think it's going to be much harder for a Trump movement to pull those people in or keep the interest of those people and support of those people. Again, I think criminal charges and these could be coming out over the next couple of years in state and from federal prosecutors about Trump and the Trump family, as well as others in the Trump administration, not just about the events of last week, but about things that have been happening over the past few years. Courts are loath to go after, and prosecutors too, to go after a sitting president because it's very disruptive to the country. But now that he's no longer, or will shortly be, no longer be president, that will change. So I think that also could cause the collapse of Trumpism. Obviously, the sentiment, the sort of misogynistic, xenophobic, racist, violent sentiment of the Trump movement might move to something else, and there'll be some new leader or some new version of it, and that's very worrying. And we need to ask ourselves what supports that. You know, what's wrong with our education system that people are graduating from high school or from college and don't understand how to check facts or don't have a critical view of looking at claims from several perspectives. The journal Inside Higher Education had online last week a very interesting article on this topic on what's wrong with how we teach current events and history and teach critical thinking skills in high school and college that leads to the situation where there's some adults that can't rationally process basic facts, such as about the election and whatnot. What responsibility do some news outlets have for this, and what responsibility does social media have for the rise of Trump or the spread of misinformation or the spread of even of violence and violent propaganda? I don't have answers to these questions, but they're going to have to be addressed in the future. I will point out, I forgot to mention the Senate race in Georgia might also indicate that there's a backlash against Trump. It's not clear what may have caused the two Democrats to win in Georgia. Clearly, there was a lot of work for turnout by African Americans and in the Democratic Party, and that was successful. And we did see a slight decline, as my understanding, in Republican turnout in the special elections. And some of that may have been due to Trump constantly attacking the Republican leadership in Georgia and attacking the legitimacy of elections in Georgia. That may have led to people being pessimistic about voting, but it may have led people to also be just turned off by Trump and therefore not turn out for the Republican Party. I know Republican leaders were very concerned about that possibility. Whether or not that happened, we don't know, but it's worth thinking about that Trump's nature of attacking former allies aggressively may also be a signal to the end of that movement. Finally, I want to just mention the importance, I think, of rethinking how we pick candidates for president. Over the past 40 years, we've gone from Reagan to Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump. Very different kinds of conservatism in the three of those administrations, and then two liberal or liberal centrist administrations by Democrats. That's 40 years of very unusual change. And I wonder what impact that has on unity and stability for people's identity as a nation. Also, I think Trump will likely go down as one of the worst, if not the worst president in our history. And people may now look back fondly on George W. Bush as president, but recall at the time he was also viewed largely as a very poor president and a failed presidency in many ways. So how did we come to a situation where here in the 21st century, we've had two awful presidents? And I'm not saying that for partisan reasons. I'm just saying that objectively, their administrations failed on many of their greatest campaigns or efforts. Well, I think we need to change how we pick candidates for the major parties. And we have turnouts that are low in the primaries. And by having many candidates run, with people being allowed to just vote for one candidate, it means that candidates who have positions that are appealing to a wide percentage of the voters, but there's multiple candidates all making the same appeal, voters will split amongst them, and then someone can sneak in with a very small percent, 20, 25% of the vote, and winner takes all in the plurality system that we use. So we need to look at voting systems where people on one ballot can express more than just one name, that they can express a range of preferences or a range of intensity of preferences, so that a system creates, in fact, a winner who has broader, deeper, wider support amongst the electorate or amongst those that party. And there's several ways to do that. There's no perfect system, but I think we have to seriously explore doing that. We also need to explore reforming the Electoral College, of course. One reform I don't hear people mentioning, but that I've been investigating, is that Congress, without changing the Constitution, Congress decides how many members there are in the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives hasn't changed that number since Alaska and Hawaii were admitted. And based on some number crunching I did last year, it looks like if you add about 120 members to the size of the U.S. House, that would, by influencing how many electoral votes states have in the Electoral College, that would give greater, not perfect, but greater equality to larger states, which right now have much less strength in the Electoral College than they should have given their size. So that can be done without changing the Constitution. I don't think the public would like the idea of adding 120 new members of Congress, since people don't like Congress. But given that the U.S. is over 330 million people right now, having 550 members or so in the U.S. House of Representatives doesn't strike me as actually unreasonable. But that's just a new thought to leave you with. All right, thank you, and I hope you have a good year.